Okay, so here's something they don't teach you in school, and they definitely don't cover it in a 30-second Netflix history breakdown. You've probably heard the Xhosa language, maybe in a documentary, maybe in Black Panther, maybe just in a clip online that went viral because someone's grandmother was throwing down an impossible sequence of sounds that your brain simply cannot parse. It sounds almost like a river flowing over rocks, and then suddenly, a click, a pop, a sound you'd usually make to call a cat, right in the middle of a polysyllabic word that carries the weight of a 1,000-year-old story. What you probably don't know is that every single one of those clicks is basically a genetic fingerprint screaming out loud in a crowded room. It's a ghost in the machine. A DNA test on any Xhosa person, and I mean any, shows an ancestry so old and so weird that most other African populations on the continent lost this plot line 5,000 years ago. We're talking about a genetic signature that rewrites everything you thought you knew about Nelson Mandela's people. And yeah, we're going to talk about Mandela in a second, because his personal DNA, it broke the internet among geneticists. Picture this. You're scrolling through Google, maybe you're procrastinating on work, and you stumble onto a massive global genome project. This isn't 23andMe telling you if you think cilantro tastes like soap. This is deep, hardcore population genetics, where scientists in cold labs sequence millions of markers to figure out who moved where, and who loved whom, 10,000 years ago. A group of South African researchers, along with heavy hitters from places like the University of Johannesburg and Witwatersrand, looked at these DNA results and essentially had a wait, hold up moment. They were staring at the genomes of Bantu-speaking groups down in southern Africa, and the Xhosa data points kept flying off the chart. Specifically, you look at a paper like Schlebusch et al. Back in 2012 in Science, a massive landmark paper, and they're mapping out the genomic variation in Khoisan groups. But when they bring in the Bantu-speaking agriculturalists for comparison, the Xhosa don't look like pure migrants. They look like a remix, a mashup, a beautifully messy Venn diagram of the oldest DNA on Earth and the Iron Age expansion that reshaped the continent. Because here's the dirty, not-so-secret secret of human history that makes certain people uncomfortable. The idea of pure populations is a fantasy sold to you by 19th century dudes with measuring tapes. The truth is way cooler. The Xhosa Nation, roughly 9 to 10 million people strong today, the second largest ethnic group in modern South Africa, are technically a Bantu-speaking people. Their language, isiXhosa, is part of the massive Niger-Congo language family branch. But when they arrived in the southern tip of Africa, roughly between 500 and 1500 CE during the Great Bantu expansions, historians call it the Nguni migration down the eastern seaboard, they crashed into a very different world. They didn't find an empty continent. They found a genetic superpower that had been hanging out there, largely undisturbed, for an unbroken stretch of time that makes the pyramids look like a new-build condo. This is where the Khoisan come in, and if you say Khoisan to a geneticist, their eyes light up like it's Christmas morning. The term Khoisan actually bundles together two groups of people who were historically pastoralists and hunter-gatherers. The Khoi, the herders, and the San, the hunter-gatherers. These aren't just some African tribes. These groups represent the deepest-rooted, oldest continuous human lineages on the entire planet. We're talking about a population whose ancestors dominated southern Africa for over 150,000 years. I'll say that again. 150,000 years. Before the Bantu farmers migrated south, before the Europeans sailed anywhere, before agriculture itself was a thing in most of the world, the ancestors of the Khoisan were walking those coasts and deserts, developing a unique genetic architecture that is more diverse than any other human group. They are essentially the trunk of the human family tree, while the rest of us, including most of Europe and Asia, are just some twigs branching off one tiny bough. So what happens when an unstoppable force meets an immovable object? You get the Xhosa. The Bantu migrants, the Nguni ancestors of the Xhosa, didn't just march in and replace them. Instead, there was a massive, centuries-long interaction. They traded, they fought, and, critically for our story, they heavily intermarried. The DNA doesn't lie. When you look at the published data, specifically from massive genomic sweeps like the one by Uren et al. In 2016, on fine-scale population structure, or the deep sequencing by Choudhury in 2020 in Nature, the numbers jump out at you. Xhosa people today carry somewhere between 13 and 15% Khoisan ancestry on average. Some individuals carry much more, some a bit less, but that's the average genetic load. That is the highest percentage of Khoisan admixture found in any Bantu-speaking population on the face of the earth. Not a little splash of DNA here and there, like a dash of hot sauce on a burrito. We're talking about a solid sixth of their genetic makeup. That's a grandparent. A fully assimilated ancestor group that changed everything. Let's talk about the men for a second, because the Y chromosome data tells a very specific, very dramatic story. Y DNA gets passed down from father to son, mostly unchanged. If you look at the Xhosa Y chromosome profiles, you see the classic Bantu expansion signature. About 78% of Xhosa men carry a variant called E1B1A. That's the Bantu marker. That's the Niger-Congo, we are farmers and we are moving south, badge of honor. But then you keep scrolling down the list, and there it is. Sitting at around 15%, you have A3B1. That's the San Khoisan signature. That's the original ancient father lineage. And then there's a little bit of B2B, another deep old African clade. This mix of Y chromosomes directly proves that when these Nguni men moved south, they didn't stick to just marrying within their own migrating community. At some point, Khoisan men were fully integrated into what would become the Xhosa political and social structure. It wasn't a one-way conquest, it was a merger. And the women? Oh, the mitochondrial DNA, the story of the mothers, is even richer, because that's often where the deepest local roots survive in a migration event. But we don't even need to go that deep into the cell right now. Let's go to the mouth. Let's talk about the clicks. Because this is the part that makes me so ridiculously happy as a science communicator. Every time a Xhosa speaker hits one of the three primary click consonants, represented in the Latin script by C, the dental click, like tisk tisk, X, the lateral click, the one you do to call a horse, and Q, the palatal click, a sharp pop off the roof of your mouth, they are making a sound that has no business being in a Bantu language. Bantu languages don't have clicks. The entire massive group of hundreds of Bantu languages uses just the regular pulmonic airstream mechanism where air comes out of your lungs. That's it. But Xhosa is a click language. Why? Because the DNA and the language move together. It's an absolute one-to-one correlation. We have this metaphor in genetics about cultural admixture, but this is a physical, linguistic borrowing of phonemes that probably happened exactly during that period of intense intermarriage. Imagine the scenario. You're an incoming agriculturalist, you're setting up homesteads, you're interacting with the deeply respected local hunter-gatherer groups who know the land and the spirits. Your sons marry their daughters, your daughters marry their sons. Suddenly, the languages start to melt into each other. The Khoi and San languages are the original click languages of the world. They are click-heavy. These aren't just little accents. Sometimes 30–40% of the vocabulary uses these sounds. The Nguni ancestors, the people who would become the Xhosa and the Zulu, adopted these clicks into specific words, often words relating to the natural world, or words that just sounded more correct in the socio-cultural context of a blended household. It's like an audio fossil. You hear a Xhosa person speak, and you are hearing the Khoisan echo. You are literally hearing the genetic absorption. Now, let's compare them to their cousins, because the contrast makes the Xhosa situation pop even more. The Zulu people are also Nguni. They're linguistic siblings, basically. They also have clicks, but not as many. The Zulu expansion happened with a slightly different dynamic, a more centralized state-building model that perhaps absorbed Khoisan groups in a less integrated, less bilateral way. And guess what the genetics show? The Zulus generally carry less Khoisan ancestry than the Xhosa. The Choudhury paper in Nature from 2020 was brilliant on this. They didn't just lump Bantu together. They sequenced over 400 South African genomes, including over 100 Xhosa individuals, and they proved mathematically that the Xhosa are a genetically distinct population, differentiable from the Zulu. It's not just a political boundary, it's a biological boundary, driven by different levels of this ancient San admixture. The Xhosa just absorbed more. They intermarried more deeply and broadly along their frontier, creating a biological and cultural synthesis that stands alone. Think about the sheer statistical anomaly of the genetic diversity here. A study by May et al. In 2013, looking at genetic diversity in Black South Africans from Soweto, delivered another gut punch to our standard views of global diversity. We are used to the narrative that Africa has the most diversity, which is true, but they crunched the numbers and found something wild. Xhosa individuals carry higher genetic diversity than most European populations. Let that sink in. You can take a random Xhosa person off the street and a random person from Spain or Finland, and the genetic variation within that Xhosa person's genome is significantly higher. Why? Because they're carrying two completely different branches of the human species in their cells. The Bantu branch, which itself is diverse, but then layered on top of that, they've absorbed the Khoisan ancient variation. The Khoisan have the highest levels of genetic diversity on the planet because they've been accumulating mutations and existing as a massive, stable population for 150,000 years. When you mix that 15% into a Bantu genome, you're not watering it down. You're supercharging the diversity. It's a genetic richness that acts as a biological library. Okay, let's get into the big name, the icon. You can't talk about Xhosa genetics and not talk about Nelson Mandela. It's almost unfair how perfectly he represents this entire story. But genetics doesn't care about our narrative convenience. Sometimes the poetry is just true. Nelson Mandela was born Rolihlala Mandela into the Thembu royal family. The Thembus are a Xhosa aristocratic clan. His documented family lineage traces his direct male line back to King Ngubengcuka, who died in 1832. He's as Xhosa as you get culturally. Now, I need to be specific here because posthumous testing via family samples always sounds like a spy novel. Geneticists didn't dig him up. That's not how this works. But through familial analysis, looking at the DNA of his known relatives and descendants who participate in genomic studies, the deep ancestry of his specific clan has been mapped. The results are just stunning. Nelson Mandela's genetic lineage showed a typical Thembu profile, which includes that roughly 14% San Khoisan ancestry. Nelson Mandela, the man who stood up against an apartheid system that tried to legally categorize people into rigid, fake racial boxes, was himself, in his very cells, a walking summary of Southern African human history. He was genetically part Bantu, part Khoi, and part San. He was living proof that the boxes are a lie. He carried the hunter-gatherer, the pastoralist, and the farmer, the oldest lineage and the expansive lineage, all wrapped up in one person who changed the world. Think about the irony, or perhaps the cosmic justice, here. The apartheid regime was obsessed with blood quantum nonsense and tribal differentiation, trying to separate Bantu from colored from white using pseudoscientific metrics. They had no idea that inside the cells of the very people they were oppressing ran the unbroken thread of the original human beings who had lived on that specific landmass for longer than any other hominid. The Khoisan ancestry in Mandela's genome is the oldest surviving lineage on the tree, period. The Schlebusch papers, especially the 2020 work on ancient genomes from the region, confirmed that the ancestors of the Khoisan were largely in place and forming their distinct genetic identity tens of thousands of years before the out-of-Africa migration that seeded the rest of the world. When you look at Nelson Mandela, you're looking at a man who descended from the people who stayed, and the people who later returned, blended into a unique human being that could only exist at the southern tip of the continent. And this genetic blend isn't just a historical plaque bolted onto the genome doing nothing. It has functional medical consequences. It saved lives. It's the kind of stuff natural selection acts on, and the Xhosa genome is littered with the scars and trophies of survival. Let's talk malaria. Sub-Saharan Africa is obviously a brutal environment for a mosquito-borne parasite. Bantu populations brought certain genetic defenses with them as they moved. But the admixture with the Khoisan shuffled the deck. You see a very high frequency of what's called the Duffy null allele in the Xhosa. The Duffy antigen is basically a doorway on the surface of red blood cells that the malaria parasite uses to break in, specifically Plasmodium vivax. If you have the null allele, you don't build the doorway. The parasite is stuck out in the rain, knocking loud, and nobody answers. The Xhosa have this protection at high levels, a gift of their deep African heritage that was refined in the crucible of the southern African environment. Then you look at the immune system. The human leukocyte antigen system, the HLA, is arguably the most important piece of DNA you have for fighting disease. It's what recognizes pathogens. Populations that have experienced different disease ecologies have different HLA flavors. The Urine 2016 paper really dug into this, looking at fine-scale ecogeographic boundaries. The Xhosa display unique HLA immune variants that are distinct from other Bantu-speaking groups further north, and distinct from the pure Khoisan as well. They've essentially curated a bespoke immune toolkit. It's like they went to the genetic hardware store, took the Bantu framework, but then swapped in a bunch of specialized Khoisan components that worked better in the conditions of the Eastern Cape and the Highveld. That's the power of admixture. It's not just a mixing, it's an adaptation accelerator. You're throwing together two sets of tools that have been stress-tested for totally different lifestyles over millennia, and the offspring get to pick the best of both. That's the Xhosa. There's a funny one too, because genetics always has a sense of humor to balance out the malaria and the immunity. Lactase persistence, the ability to digest milk as an adult. In Northern Europe, over 90% of people can do it. It's the most famous recent evolutionary change in humans. The Bantu expansion was largely driven by agriculture, right? So you might assume that a Nguni pastoralist culture, which the Xhosa heavily are, famous for their cattle, the Nguni cattle with the beautiful hides, would have rocketed that lactase persistence gene up to 100%. Nope. Genetically, the frequency of lactase persistence in the Xhosa is low, something around 15%. It's a tiny genetic quirk that tells you a lot about history. It suggests that the cultural practice of herding cattle came first, and the genetics lagged behind. Or, maybe, they just processed the milk into yogurt and cheese, fermenting it to break down the lactose, which is exactly what a smart civilization would do. The Khoisan hunter-gatherers wouldn't have had the gene either, obviously, so there was no positive selective pressure pushing it up from that side of the marriage. The Xhosa solved the dairy problem with technology, not just biology. They don't need a mutation to enjoy their amasi, the fermented milk that's a staple of the diet. They just use their brains. Now, we should step back and visualize the migration map, because the geography of this story is critical. We're talking about the Nguni migrations slowly moving down the eastern part of the continent. They're hugging the coastline, eventually hitting the area around modern-day KwaZulu-Natal and the Eastern Cape. When they arrive, they hit the edge of the Kalahari Basin and the Cape Floristic region. The terrain isn't just flat savanna, it's diverse. Rivers, mountains, thickets. This creates ecogeographic boundaries that the urine paper identified. Populations don't just randomly mix. They stop at these boundaries. The Xhosa expansion sort of stalled and pooled along the Fish River region, right on the frontier, for a long time. On the other side of that frontier, the Khoi pastoralists and the San hunter-gatherers. That frontier became a zone of exchange. It became a melting pot. The Xhosa identity wasn't forged in the middle of a massive, homogeneous Bantu empire. It was forged on the edge. The word Xhosa itself, according to some oral traditions, likely comes from a Khoisan leader who was absorbed into the Nguni lineage. The identity is a coalition built on the boundary. It makes you think about the concept of assimilation. Usually, when we talk about the spread of Bantu languages and agriculture, the narrative is grim for the hunter-gatherers. They are frequently erased. The Pygmies of Central Africa, the Xhosa in Tanzania, the San in the South, they become small, marginalized remnants of a forgotten age. And yes, that tragedy also happened in South Africa. The San populations were decimated and pushed into the most inhospitable deserts. But the Xhosa story is slightly different. It's not a story of total annihilation, it's a story of absorption. You look at a Xhosa person, and you're not looking at someone who replaced the Khoisan. You're looking at someone who, in a very real genetic and cultural sense, is the Khoisan, just reorganized. The cliques are still there. The blood is still there. It's a legacy that survived genocide and colonialism precisely because it merged into a larger, agriculturally powerful social structure. It's a biological and cultural survival strategy operating on a monumental scale. Let's talk about a paper that blew the doors off this whole field, Schuster et al., in 2010, published in Nature. They did these incredible comparisons, mapping whole genome sequences from indigenous hunter-gatherers in southern Africa, including famous San individuals, and laying them right next to a Bantu genome that was clearly representative of someone like a Xhosa individual. The phylogenetic trees they drew show exactly the split we're talking about. The San go deep. The branching pattern suggests that the lineage leading to the San diverged from the lineage leading to most other Africans around the time modern humans were first becoming a thing. Then, sitting right there on the graph, you see the Bantu line, but it's not a clean split. There's a faint line of genetic gravity pulling the Xhosa slightly backwards in time, backwards toward that San divergence point. That's the 15% mixture doing its mathematical work. It's pulling the Xhosa centroid away from pure Bantu and anchoring it to the most ancient root of the phylogenetic tree. Statistically, when you run a principal component analysis on global populations, a pure Bantu from Central Africa shoots off in one direction, a European shoots off in another, an Asian in another, and deep sand hunter-gatherers sit way out on an island of their own. The Xhosa? They sit exactly on the bridge. They are the bridge population linking the deepest roots of humanity to the Iron Age demographic expansion. And it really messes with the timeline we usually have in our heads. We're obsessed with Egypt, Mesopotamia, ancient Greece. We think of 3,000 years ago as deep history. For the genetic component that lives inside a Xhosa person, 3,000 years ago was a Tuesday. It's a lineage where the population structure was mostly set by the time there were still Neanderthals walking around Europe. The Bantu part of the Xhosa genome is relatively recent, but the Khoisan part? That's geological time. So when you hear someone speak Xhosa and that X click fires off the side of their tongue, it's not just a linguistic quirk to learn on a travel app. It's a vibration that has been bouncing around in human mouths for 150,000 years. It just happens to now be integrated into a vocabulary that discusses smartphones, politics, and soccer. Let's bring this home and get a bit provocative, because if there was ever a script that needed an opinion, it's this one. The scientific establishment, especially Western-focused genetic studies, spent decades obsessed with European population history. They spent millions of dollars figuring out the difference between a German and a Frenchman, which is essentially a rounding error. But the big, heavy, important questions about who we are as a species, they're buried right here in a Xhosa chromosome. The fact that a single population can serve as a living reference for the oldest diversity on Earth, and simultaneously one of the most recent massive demographic events on the continent, is scientifically criminal to ignore. Every time a Xhosa person spits into a tube for a DNA test, they're handing a scientist a time machine. You're not just looking at ancestry from 200 years ago. You're looking at a collision of lineages that split from each other before some of our ancestors lost their fur. That is what secret ancestry means. It's not a secret because people chose to hide it. It's a secret because the physical evidence, the teeth, the tongues, the bones, has been hiding in plain sight this whole time, waiting for the technology to catch up and read the code. The beauty of the post-genomic era is that it forces us to reconcile history with biology. We know from oral tradition that the Xhosa respected the San as spiritual guides. The San rock art is some of the most hauntingly beautiful art ever created by human hands. The Khoi herders taught the Bantu incomers about the local vegetation and the fat-tailed sheep. All of this cultural exchange we used to talk about metaphorically, now it's literally mapped onto the double helix. The history isn't lost, it's archived in the A's, T's, C's, and G's. We used to think of Bantu expansion as a simple steamroller. The Schlebusch papers, the Choudhury papers, the May papers, they collectively tell a very different story. It was a dance. A slow, generational negotiation between two worlds, where the newcomers ended up changing just as much as the incumbents did. The Xhosa ended up with a language that pops and clicks, and a genome where nearly 1 in every 7 ancestors was a hunter-gatherer who knew the stars in a completely different way. So, why does this matter for the guy watching this video on his phone while commuting? Because it destroys the myth of static identity. Mandela's people, the Xhosa, aren't pure Bantu. They aren't pure San. They are an active, biological synthesis. This means the concept of ethnicity in Africa is fluid, dynamic, and complex. Not this tribalist, siloed version of reality that pops up in outdated textbooks. The most famous South African of all time was a living bridge, literally, down to his base pairs. He carried the DNA of the most ancient Southern people into the 20th and 21st centuries. That's a level of representation nobody planned, but biology provided. When the May 2013 study showed the high genetic diversity in Soweto, it wasn't just a trivia stat, it was a testament to the resilience of mixing. In a world that feels like it's constantly trying to build walls, the molecules inside the Xhosa cell are screaming, "The walls have always been a lie." Think about the immune system again for a second, because it's just so cool. I mentioned that unique HLA variant set. The Choudhury 2020 high-depth genome analysis really pointed this out. They're not just carrying an average of African and Khoisan immunity. They've got specific variants that evolved on that Khoisan background for dealing with local gut parasites and regional viral loads. When the Bantu came down, they brought their own immunity, but it was calibrated for Central African pathogens. The Khoisan immunity was calibrated for the Cape. The Xhosa are a new model of a human being, a best of both worlds biological entity that could survive the specific mix of bacteria, viruses, and climate challenges of the South African coast. That's why you see them thriving demographically. It wasn't just about having more babies because of farming. It was about having the right babies, with the right genetic shields, built from a combination of parts. It's almost like the Xhosa genome is a perfectly designed hybrid car, running on both the old electric battery of the ancient past and the combustion engine of the agricultural revolution. And look, I'm just going to say it. It's kind of funny how geneticists sometimes get awkward when they have to say admixture instead of purity, like the admixture is an impurity. That's just bad semantics. Admixture is the upgrade. The Bantu speakers coming down were incredibly successful, sure. The Khoisan hunter-gatherers were perfectly adapted to the harsh conditions, but existed at a low population density. The fusion created a group that could both explode in population numbers using pastoralism and agriculture, while retaining the genetic adaptations necessary to handle the specific UV radiation, the specific water availability, and the specific disease profile of the region. That's not dilution, that's biological sophistication. It's a genetic strategy that is so successful, it now defines the identity of 10 million people. Let's circle back to Nelson Mandela one more time. There's this profound thing about his life that the genetics just illuminates. He was Xhosa royal blood, the Thembu clan. He fought against a system that tried to put people into genetic boxes. He was imprisoned for 27 years, and then he emerged to unite a country that was tearing itself apart over these very concepts. And we now find out, sitting coded within his cells, was the proof that purity is a fairy tale. His ancestors were the Bantu state builders, yes, carrying that E1B1A Y chromosome signature that connects him to a massive wave of social change. But his ancestors were also the Khoi and the San, the people who made those clicks, the people who painted the animals on the rocks under the stars. Nelson Mandela's DNA literally contained the blueprint of unity. It's not just a heartwarming story to make a YouTube video go viral. It's a mathematical, published, peer-reviewed fact from the Choudhury 2020 paper and the Schlebusch analysis that his genetic profile was a microcosm of the country he was trying to build. And you, sitting there, might be wondering about your own test. If you log into 23andMe or Ancestry DNA, the algorithms they use often struggle with this level of ancient admixture. They'll just tell you West African and maybe a sprinkle of Khoisan hunter-gatherer if you're lucky. But the resolution isn't there yet in the consumer products. The real science, the stuff done with high-depth whole genome sequencing, where you're looking at 100,000 single nucleotide polymorphisms just to track the Khoisan component, shows that this 13 to 15% proportion is extremely stable across the Xhosa population. It's a founding signature. It happened early on in the formation of the identity, and then the population expanded, carrying that signature with it down through the centuries. It's not a rare personal exception, it's the rule. We also have to appreciate the sheer span of time the Khoisan component represents. When we say the Khoisan ancestors were dominant for 150,000 years, we are covering a period where the world's climate flipped multiple times. Ice ages came and went. The Sahara turned from a swamp into a desert and back again. Toba the supervolcano exploded, potentially knocking human populations down to a few thousand. And through all of that, the ancestors of the San and Khoi were in southern Africa, just persisting, adapting, building up an enormous reservoir of genetic variations, many of which are literally not found anywhere else off the continent. This is what the Schuster 2010 Nature paper highlighted. The San genomes contained more total variants, private variants that nobody else has, than any other group. That variation got passed into the Xhosa. So when we look at a Xhosa genome, we're not just looking at an African genome, we're looking at an archive of the original human software, patched with the latest Iron Age updates. It's a living fossil that's somehow also a modern, dynamic population. And the clicks keep giving this away. It's the ultimate tell. Linguistic borrowing is usually limited to words. You borrow sushi from Japanese, safari from Swahili. Borrowing phonemes? Borrowing entire sound systems? That's intimate. That doesn't happen from trading pots at a distance. That happens from nursing infants on your hip listening to a grandmother or a mother who speaks a different language. It suggests that the women, in particular, were conduits for this Khoisan admixture, bringing the click languages into the household and having the kids grow up bilingual until the clicks became standard Xhosa. It's a direct piece of archaeological evidence that we can hear today. You can close your eyes in the Eastern Cape, listen to two people talking, and hear the genetic admixture event that started 1,500 years ago. All right, we've covered the numbers, the history, the linguistic artifacts, and the royal lineage. The scientists who did this work, people like Karina Schlebusch and her team, the Choudhury Consortium, they've given us a lens that literally no historian 100 years ago could have imagined. They sequenced the genomes from ancient Egyptian and Southern African populations in 2020, and it tightened up this whole story. They showed that the Khoisan were not a small, dying group. They were the baseline. They were the red background of the painting, and all these other figures were painted on top. The Xhosa are simply a region of that painting where the red background bleeds right through the foreground and becomes part of the subject itself. So the next time you see a photo of Nelson Mandela, or you hear Desmond Tutu cracking a joke with that razor-sharp wit, or you see Trevor Noah, who's Xhosa on his mother's side, riffing on language, remember the clicks. Remember that you're looking at a face that carries one of the only unbroken lines of existence stretching back to a time when we weren't the only humans. There were other hominins walking around, and the ancestors of the Khoisan were already here, and now they're in the Xhosa. That's not just history. That's the most epic family reunion story the planet has ever cooked up. And that's the whole picture. History was lying. DNA doesn't lie. Subscribe if you want more of this. Thank you for watching. See you in the next one. Thanks for staying until the very end. Goodbye for now.